It was my first time babysitting for the Hendersons, and I was excited but nervous. They had a 3-year-old daughter named Lily, who was adorable but very attached to her favorite doll, Rosie. Henderson had warned me that Lily wouldn't go to sleep without Rosie and to make sure the doll stayed with her at all times. The evening started off well. We had dinner, and then Lily and I played with her toys in the living room. She showed me all of Rosie's outfits and accessories, chattering away happily. By the time her bedtime rolled around, she was getting sleepy. I put her in her pajamas, brushed her teeth, and read her a bedtime story. After I tucked Lily into bed, she hugged Rosie tightly and drifted off to sleep. I closed her door softly and went downstairs to watch TV. The Hendersons had told me they wouldn't be back until late, so I settled in for a quiet night. About an hour later, I heard Lily crying upstairs. I hurried up to her room, worried she might be sick or scared. When I opened the door, I found her sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her face. "Rosie's gone," she sobbed. I looked around the room, but the doll wasn't in sight. "Don't worry, sweetie, we'll find her," I said. I searched under the bed, in the closet, and around the room, but Rosie was nowhere to be found. Lily's cries grew louder. I couldn't understand how the doll could have disappeared. I checked the hallway and the other rooms upstairs, thinking maybe Lily had taken Rosie with her during a sleepwalk, but there was no sign of the doll. I decided to look downstairs, carrying a still crying Lily with me. We checked the living room, the kitchen, and even the bathrooms, but Rosie was gone. I was starting to feel desperate. How could a doll just vanish? Then I remembered the basement. It was the only place I hadn't checked. The Hendersons had said there was nothing down there but old furniture and storage, but I figured it was worth a look. I carried Lily to the basement door and opened it, flipping the light switch. The light flickered on, holding Lily close. I descended the stairs, my heart pounding. The basement was filled with boxes, old furniture, and other forgotten items. I started looking around, moving boxes and peering behind furniture. I was about to give up when I spotted something under an old chair in the corner. I reached down and pulled out Rosie. The doll's dress was dirty, and her hair was a mess, but Lily grabbed her and hugged her tightly, her tears finally stopping. I was relieved but puzzled. How had the doll ended up in the basement? It didn't make any sense. I took Lily back upstairs and tucked her into bed with Rosie. She fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from crying. I went back downstairs, still trying to figure out what had happened. I locked the basement door and double-checked the locks on the front and back doors. When the Hendersons returned, I told them what had happened. They were surprised and a bit concerned, but didn't have any explanations. Mrs. Henderson assured me they would look into it and thanked me for finding Rosie. The next time I babysat for the Hendersons, I made sure to keep an even closer eye on Lily and Rosie. I muted the TV and listened. There it was again, a gentle but persistent thump. I hurried upstairs and found Lily's door slightly ajar. The evening went smoothly again until after Lily had gone to bed. I was watching TV when I heard a noise from upstairs. It wasn't a cry or a call for help, but a soft thumping sound. I muted the TV and listened. There it was again, a gentle but persistent thump. I hurried upstairs and found Lily's door slightly ajar. Peeking in, I saw her fast asleep, clutching Rosie. The room was still and quiet, and I couldn't identify the source of the noise. I quietly closed the door and turned to head back downstairs when I heard it again. This time from the hallway. It seemed to be coming from the attic. The attic door was in the hallway just a few feet from Lily's room. I opened the door slowly and pulled down the ladder. The attic was dark, and the only light came from a small window at the far end. I climbed up cautiously, not wanting to disturb anything. The attic was dusty and filled with old boxes and furniture covered in sheets. As I moved through the space, I noticed dusty footprints leading from the attic door to a corner of the attic. My heart raced. Could Lily have been up here? But why and how? She was too little to climb up the ladder on her own. I followed the footprints and found a small, old-fashioned trunk tucked behind some boxes. It was slightly open. I lifted the lid, and to my astonishment, inside was Rosie. The doll was covered in dust, her dress askew. I quickly grabbed her and headed back downstairs, making sure to close the attic door behind me. I checked on Lily, who was still sound asleep. How had Rosie gotten up there? I cleaned the doll off and placed her gently next to Lily. The rest of the night was uneventful. The next morning, I told Henderson about the attic. She looked puzzled and slightly uneasy. However, she promised to check the attic for any signs of intruders or hazards. Over the next few weeks, strange things continued to happen. Every time I babysat, Rosie would disappear and reappear in the most unlikely places: the garage, the kitchen pantry, even once outside in the garden. Each time, Lily would wake up crying for her doll. And each time, I would search the house until I found Rosie and returned her to Lily's side. The Hendersons grew increasingly concerned. Henderson installed security cameras around the house, hoping to catch some clue about the mysterious doll movements. They even considered replacing Rosie, but Lily was adamant that only her Rosie would do. One evening, while watching the security footage with the Hendersons, we saw something that sent chills down our spines. In the middle of the night, the footage showed Rosie slowly moving across Lily's room, as if being dragged by an invisible force. It wasn't a glitch or a trick of the light. The doll was clearly moving on its own. We decided to do some research into the house's history. The Hendersons found out that the house had once belonged to a family who had a little girl named Rose. Rose had passed away tragically at a young age, and her favorite doll had been a cherished keepsake for the family. When the house was sold, the doll was left behind, forgotten in the attic. Mrs. Henderson suggested we bring in a local historian who knew about the house's past. The historian confirmed the story and mentioned that Rose had been very attached to her doll. Much like Lily with Rosie, the doll, it seemed, had a history of disappearing and reappearing in odd places even back then. We decided to hold a small memorial service for Rose, hoping to bring some peace to her restless spirit. We placed Rosie in the attic where Rose's belongings had been stored and said a few words, acknowledging Rose and her attachment to the doll. I needed some extra cash before heading off to college. Thompson called and asked if I could babysit her son, Timmy. I quickly agreed. I'd heard rumors about the old Thompson house on Maple Street, but I figured it was just idle gossip. After all, every small town has its spooky stories. When I arrived, Mrs. Thompson greeted me warmly. She was a tall, thin woman with kind eyes but a worried expression. Mr. Thompson was equally pleasant but seemed a bit distracted. "Thank you for coming, Jenny," Mrs. Thompson said as she led me into the living room. "Timmy is already asleep upstairs. He's a sound sleeper and shouldn't give you any trouble, no problem, Mrs. Thompson. I'll keep an eye on him," I assured her. The house was old, with creaky floors and antique furniture. It had a certain charm, but it also felt a bit eerie. The Thompsons gave me a list of emergency numbers, showed me where the snacks were, and headed out. I settled onto the couch with my homework, ready for an easy night. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. I tried to focus on my homework, but the silence was unnerving. Around 9 p.m., I decided to check on Timmy. Climbing the narrow staircase, I was extra careful not to make too much noise. His room was at the end of the hall. I opened the door quietly and peeked inside. He was fast asleep, just as his parents had said. Relieved, I closed the door and headed back downstairs. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard a faint noise like a whisper. I froze, straining to listen, but it stopped. Shaking my head, I convinced myself it was just the house settling. Old houses make noises, I reminded myself. An hour later, I heard a thud from upstairs. I set my books aside and rushed up the stairs. I opened Timmy's door and found him still sleeping peacefully. There was nothing out of place, but as I turned to leave, I noticed the closet door was slightly open. I was sure it had been closed earlier. I crossed the room and shut the door firmly before heading back downstairs. Back in the living room, just as I was starting to relax, I heard a giggle. It was soft, almost inaudible, but it sent chills down my spine. I looked around the room, but there was nothing unusual. Everything was exactly as it had been when I first arrived. By 11 p.m., I was struggling to keep my eyes open. I decided to make some tea to stay awake. As I waited for the kettle to boil, I heard the giggle again, this time louder and closer. I spun around, but the kitchen was empty. As I turned off the stove and walked into the living room, there on the coffee table was a small toy soldier. I hadn't noticed it earlier, and I was sure it wasn't there when I first sat down. I picked it up, examining it. Timmy's toys were upstairs. How had this one ended up here? I decided to check on Timmy again. I climbed the stairs. When I reached his room, I found him still asleep. But the closet door was open again, just a crack. I closed it firmly and whispered to myself, "Old houses, old noises. That's all this is." As I left Timmy's room, I noticed the door to the room at the end of the hall. Earlier, it had been locked, but now it was slightly ajar. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to stay away, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached the door and pushed it open. The room was empty except for a few old pieces of furniture covered in white sheets. Dust filled the air, and I could see small handprints on the window, too high for Timmy to have made. I quickly backed out of the room, closing the door behind me. I hurried downstairs. I decided to call my friend Mark, who knew a lot about the history of our town. Maybe he could give me some answers. "Hey Mark, it's Jenny. I'm babysitting at the Thompson house and weird things are happening." "Weird?" Howie asked. I told him about the noises, the toy soldier, and the handprints. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That house used to belong to the Millers," he said finally. "Their little boy went missing back in the 1950s. They never found him. The house has been empty for years until the Thompsons moved in. Do you think it's his spirit?" "I don't know," Mark replied. "But if things get worse, you should leave." "Thanks, Mark. I'll keep you posted." I hung up and tried to focus on my homework, but my mind kept drifting back to what Mark had said. Around midnight, I heard the giggle again. It was coming from the living room. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously walked towards the sound. The room was empty, but I felt a cold draft, even though all the windows were closed. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. When I finally got it to work, I scanned the room. Nothing. Just then, I heard a whisper right behind me. "Help me." I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart raced as I rushed upstairs to check on Timmy. He was still asleep, completely unaware of the strange happenings. I noticed the closet door was open again. I shone the flashlight inside, empty. I backed out of the room, determined to stay awake until the Thompsons returned. At 1 a.m., the front door opened, and the Thompsons walked in. Thompson saw my pale face and rushed over. "Jenny, are you okay?" "What happened?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "I heard noises and I think there's something in the house." Thompson looked concerned. "We've heard some strange things too, but we thought it was just the house settling. I found a toy soldier that wasn't there before." "And I heard a voice," I said. Thompson exchanged a worried look with her husband. "We'll look into it. Thank you for staying, Jenny. Here's your pay. You should get home and get some rest." I nodded, grateful to leave the house. I took the money and hurried out the door, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders as I stepped outside. I never went back to the Thompson house. A few weeks later, I heard that the Thompsons had moved out. Rumor had it that they couldn't handle the strange occurrences either. The house on Maple Street remained empty once again. Though I never saw a ghost, I knew that something or someone was there, lingering in the shadows, waiting for help that never came. Babysitting has always been my go-to job for extra cash, and I've had plenty of uneventful nights. But one particular night still sends shivers down my spine. It happened a couple of years ago, but I remember every detail vividly. The Carters were a new family in our neighborhood, with a 6-month-old baby named Emma. Mrs. Carter called me one Friday afternoon, asking if I could babysit Emma that night. They had an important event to attend and needed someone to watch her until late. I agreed, happy to help and earn some money. When I arrived at their house around 6 p.m., Mrs. Carter greeted me warmly and introduced me to Emma, who was a sweet and curious baby. Mr. Carter joined us and showed me around the house, pointing out where things were and giving me emergency contact numbers. "Emma usually goes to bed around 8 p.m., Mrs. Carter explained. "She loves her bedtime routine, so make sure to follow it. And don't forget to lock all the doors and windows. We've heard about some suspicious activity in the area recently." That last bit of information made me a little uneasy, but I nodded and assured them I would keep everything secure. They left around 6:30 p.m., and Emma and I spent the next hour and a half playing with her toys and having fun. She was a delightful baby, and the time flew by. At around 7:30 p.m., I started Emma's bedtime routine. I changed her diaper, put her in her pajamas, and fed her a bottle. After that, I rocked her gently in the nursery chair while humming a lullaby. By the time 8 p.m. rolled around, her eyes were starting to droop. I carefully placed Emma in her crib, turned on the baby monitor, and quietly left the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. I went downstairs to the living room, double-checking that all the doors and windows were locked. I settled on the couch, flipping through channels until I found a movie to watch. The house was quiet, and for the first hour, everything seemed perfectly normal. Around 9 p.m., I heard a noise from the baby monitor. It sounded like a soft thud. I paused the movie and listened closely, trying to make out the sounds. My heart started to race as I heard what sounded like a faint whisper. I couldn't make out the words. Grabbing the baby monitor, I slowly made my way up the stairs, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be happening. When I reached the nursery, I gently pushed the door open and peeked inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. Emma was floating a few feet above her crib, her tiny body suspended in midair. Her eyes were closed, and she seemed completely unaware of what was happening. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the scene remained the same. My first instinct was to rush in and grab Emma, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. I stared in disbelief, trying to process what I was seeing. Then, just as suddenly as it started, Emma slowly descended back into her crib, as if an invisible hand had gently lowered her. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone and called Carter. She answered on the second ring, her voice filled with concern when she heard the panic in mine. "Carter, something really strange just happened," I stammered. I went to check on Emma, and she was floating above her crib. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Mrs. Carter spoke again, her voice trembling slightly. "We're on our way home. Just stay with Emma and keep her safe. We'll be there as soon as we can." I hung up the phone and took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I walked into the nursery, keeping my eyes on Emma the whole time. She was still sound asleep. I reached into the crib and gently touched her, half expecting her to float again, but she remained solid and grounded. I sat in the nursery chair, watching over Emma until the Carters returned, and I kept glancing at the crib to make sure Emma was still there. When the Carters finally arrived, I could see the worry etched on their faces. Carter rushed to the crib, checking on Emma while Mr. Carter turned to me, his expression a mix of concern and disbelief. "Tell us exactly what happened," he said. I recounted the events, describing how I had heard strange noises on the baby monitor and found Emma floating above her crib. The Carters listened intently, exchanging worried glances. "We've never experienced anything like this before," Mrs. Carter said, her voice shaky. "Emma has always been a normal, healthy baby," Mr. Carter nodded, looking deep in thought. "We'll have to look into this. Maybe there's a logical explanation, but for now we need to ensure Emma's safety." They thanked me for staying calm and watching over Emma, and I left their house that night feeling a mix of relief. The experience left me shaken, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong.